6 seats with a turbine up front. It's not a bad dream if you're a general aviation pilot. Go fast, haul along some family and friends, sip fuel. The only downside is a lack of power plant redundancy, but that's mostly made up for by the Pratt & Whitney PT-6A. It's a bulletproof wonderkin. If you see a propeller mated to a turbine, it's probably powered by some version of the PT-6A. It wasn't the first home run for Pratt & Whitney. Born in the shadow of World War I, the first engine the company produced was the venerable Wasp Radial. They're still in use today in agricultural aircraft. Versions of it were also used by Wiley Post and Amelia Earhart. It powered the piston war in the skies over Europe and afterwards marked the first great chapter in passenger aviation. For a bit over $2 million, you can get a PT-6A with an aircraft attached to it. The airplane in question was delivered to the owner with 45 and a half hours on the airframe in 2007. It had a few gremlins. Soon after delivery, the pilot wrote it up for a flickering primary flight display. More a nuisance than anything, the aircraft had 2 identical ones installed. More seriously, he also wrote it up for a pitch trim runaway. A chief pilot for a Challenger 601 recounted a chance encounter he had with the owner pilot a couple months prior to the accident flight. He overheard the pilot having a stern phone call in the lounge area at Waco Airport. The accident pilot was demanding that Qatar Aviation pick his plane up to fly it back to San Antonio. He stated that he had no confidence in the aircraft. The work order on the squawks followed the tried and true aviation standard of could not replicate. While the aircraft was relocated from Waco, Texas to San Antonio, it was noted that the pitch trim system functioned normally. The NTSB does not comment on whether representatives at Qatar or the pilot himself flew the repositioning flight. Maintenance documents reported that the aircraft flew an additional leg without malfunction. 7 flight hours later, the aircraft crashed into a field and slid into a barn. It was consumed by a post-fire blaze. The responding police officer was unable to approach the aircraft due to smoke and flames. Once the fire was extinguished, he discovered the charred remains of the pilot lying on the ground to the left of the airplane. The pilot was 65 years old with an instrument rating. He'd logged his first flying lessons in the shadow of 9/11. The National Aerospace System had just been reopened for only a couple of weeks when he began what would be the long process of earning his private pilot's license. He soloed the following April with 66 hours total time. It took another year and a half before he attempted his first private pilot check ride. He had logged 226 hours by that time, 206 of which were with an instructor. The log entry for the check ride indicated that it was incomplete. The NTSB does not comment on how much time passed before the check ride was successfully completed. They only note that the pilot had logged 1,049 hours by the time of the accident flight. 608 hours were listed as instructional. 58 hours were in the turboprop. 51 of those were instructional, likely related to insurance requirements. Do the math, 7 hours of true pilot and command time in the aircraft remain. The accident flight occurred in the middle of January at noon. It was 140 nautical mile cross country between Waco and San Antonio. The 500 horsepower turboprop would have made quick work of the short hop. The weather on arrival was IMC. Wind was out of the north at 7 knots. A mile and a half of visibility and light rain and mist. Variable ceilings between 600 and 1,200 feet. It was, in Texas, a chilly day as well, just a few degrees above freezing. The pilot was given vectors for the ILS to what is now runway 31 left. He explained to the controller that he wanted to fly a coupled approach and he requested joining the localizer at least 3 miles from the outer marker. A few minutes later, the pilot was cleared for the approach into San Antonio and instructed to contact tower. Less than a minute later, the aircraft began to deviate from the localizer. The tower controller inquired him about it and the pilot requested a new heading. The controller instructed him to climb to 3,000 feet and turn to a heading of 180. The controller issued vectors for another approach to the runway. The pilot once again requested an intercept 3 miles from the outer marker. The controller assured him that he'd give him plenty of space, and he vectored the pilot once again towards the localizer and cleared him once again for the approach. 20 seconds later, the turboprop was flying southwest bound, which represents a pretty large deviation from the 330 heading to intercept that the controller had given him. The approach controller inquired him about it, but the pilot did not respond. 20 seconds and another unanswered radio call later, the controller gave new heading and altitude instructions. He told the pilot, "We'll try it again." The pilot responded, "It's just not coupling." The controller once again turned the aircraft to the south and instructed the pilot to climb to 3,000 feet. The The pilot acknowledged the instruction but failed to climb. Better than a minute passed. The controller twice inquired about the altitude. The pilot finally stated that he was approaching 3,000. Radar data showed him level at 2,600 feet. 90 seconds later, he was once again flying off of course. Things were rapidly deteriorating. The controller became greatly alarmed at the aircraft's altitude. He stated, "You need to be at a safe altitude, sir, at 3,000 feet." The turboprop was low and heading south, 130 degrees off course. A retired Navy pilot saw the single-engine turboprop descend through the clouds. The witness had 1,700 hours as an instructor on the T-34C, which was installed with the same PT-6A engine as the accident aircraft. He stated that the aircraft descended to 300 feet above the ground before turning south. The aircraft flew out of view for a couple of minutes and reappeared heading north. The witness stated that this time it appeared to be moving much slower. The sleek turboprop began rolling to the right, ultimately reaching an estimated 60 degrees of bank. At this point, the nose fell through the horizon, the aircraft entered a steep descent, and it disappeared behind trees. A fireball followed not long after. The retired Navy pilot had this to say: "The aircraft exhibited a classic approach turn to stall maneuver with no altitude to recover." Somewhere in the middle of this, the pilot finally responded to the approach controller's panicked inquiries regarding his errant altitude and heading. He stated only, "1 moment, please, sir." The controller, sensing what the problem was, responded, "Let me know when you have the aircraft under control." 13 seconds later, the pilot uttered his final recorded words. "I've got an emergency here. I've lost control. I gotta get out of here. It's just not coupling." The pilot said that following each of the first 2 attempts. It's uncertain what exactly he was referring to. The NTSB noted in their final report that the ILS approach did not require an autopilot. Given the substantial difficulty the pilot had maintaining heading and altitude, it seems clear that the autopilot was disconnected at some point during both approaches. 600 hours of instruction means something. The accident site didn't yield any suspicious clues, so the NTSB apparently decided against interviewing the flight instructors who had provided those hours. We could only guess at how they would have assessed the accident pilot's flying skills. In over 1,000 hours of experience, 60% were logged as instruction. There was something else, too. The medical examiner issued a toxicological report. Several metabolites were discovered in the blood and the liver. The Aerospace Medical Division of the FAA noted that the results indicated the pilot was taking Zoloft, which is an antidepressant, as well as a prescription antihistamine for allergies. Neither drug was approved for flight. If the accident pilot had reported either of them to the FAA, he would have been grounded. Depression is a potentially disqualifying medical condition, but the antihistamine was more likely to be a contributor to the accident. A side effect of the drug is drowsiness. It's the sort of thing you don't want to be dealing with in a high-performance aircraft on a rainy day. Somewhere, sometime, someone needs to say no.
69 Charlie Alpha.
Charlie Alpha, commit setting 180 for maintain 3,000.
Yes, I'm trying to fly a coupled approach here to the runway, and I need to get about 3 miles outside the outer marker if possible. Sure, I've got an emergency here. I'm along